This week I started a new sweater project and I knitted the outside of my folded collar and half twisted rib. This is what it looks like. And I knitted the inside of my folded collar just in 1x1 ribbing because I was too lazy to do the half twisted rib on the inside. And this is what that looks like, and I think you can see the difference pretty well. So I was also surprised to see how big of a difference it actually made, and I decided to compile a small list of little tips and tricks that you can do to make your knitting look a little bit better, be a little bit more practical in the end. I've divided them into 4 categories. So the first one is called refinements, so just small improvements you can make while knitting that make the finished outcome look more polished. Then I have some tips to achieve a better fit. I have some tips on how to fix small mistakes you make while knitting, and lastly I have a category called usability, which just includes some tips on how to have the best possible experience with your knit and with your finished object. So let's get started. The first thing I included in my list is obviously the twisted rib. I only knitted half twisted rib. There's also a full twisted rib that is just called twisted rib. So basically when you knit ribbing, let's say you knit a basic 1x1 rib, you knit 1 stitch, then you purl 1 stitch, then you knit 1 stitch, and so on. And for the full twisted rib, you would just knit every single stitch through the back loop. So you would knit through the back loop and then purl through the back loop and do that all the way through. And because that is very time consuming, because nobody likes to purl through the back loop. I mean, at least I avoid it at all costs if I can, because I really hate to do that. There's also a slightly faster version that I feel like also yields very good results, which is half twisted rib, where you only twist your knit stitches. So you would knit through the back loop and then you would purl a normal stitch and then just continue like that. And I mean, you can see the difference that it makes. I think it just looks so much clearer, like you can see the knit columns so much better. And I guess you could make this look a little bit more neat even with the full twisted ribbing, but for me personally, I don't think that's worth it. So that is definitely something I will be doing more often. I somehow forget about it all the time, like I will work the hem or the collar already and then remember it exists, and miraculously here I remembered at least when I was halfway done with the collar, so I can have the outside look pretty. And my second tip is going to be doing a stretchy bind-off alternative, because I feel like a lot of patterns tend to, for the sake of keeping it easy, have a bind-off that is not the most suitable. This is a pair of gloves I've recently made. These are mostly the penny gloves. I mean, I did follow the pattern kind of, but I switched yarn in between and made them shorter and whatever. But generally, this is the penny gloves by Petite Knit. And the bind-off up here was something I was not very happy with the way it was in the pattern, which was just a normal bind-off. And a normal bind-off is not very stretchy, and I find that a lot of patterns that I come across seem to have a normal bind-off where you just pass the stitch over, when actually where the bind-off is placed would call for something more stretchy, like here, because, you know, this is where you kind of move your fingers and you want to be able to put this on and take it off comfortably. And I did do the normal bind-off first and then unraveled it and did a sewn bind-off instead. I feel like people sometimes shy away from putting more complicated bind-offs in patterns. Sometimes I see that with the Italian bind-off, where for ribbing there'll just be a normal bind-off instead of something like an Italian bind-off, which makes sense in more beginner-friendly patterns, I guess, because the Italian bind-off especially is quite complicated. But the sewn bind-off is something I don't see used very often, and it's one of my favorites because it is very easy. You essentially just purl 2 stitches together and then knit one of them off your needle, and that's all you do throughout the entire length of your bind-off, and it looks pretty neat. It works in stockinette and it's very stretchy, as you can see. So if you don't know about that bind-off, it's something definitely worth looking into, I find. So that is a change I make quite often, and I feel like makes a big difference in the finished outcome. Like, it's just so much more fun to put on a sweater or a pair of gloves or anything that actually stretches over your body the way it's supposed to. And then my next tip is jogless stripes. I think that's a more popular one. I think most people do that, but essentially if you're knitting something striped in the round, like this wonderful sweater that is the first knitted sweater I ever made. It still looks great. I love this one. Anyways, if you're knitting something in the round that has stripes, you're essentially knitting a spiral. So when you switch colors at the beginning of round and you do that all the way through, you will see like a little step, like a little difference. You can see like a line where your beginning of round used to be. And even though this was my first ever knitted sweater, I actually ripped back on this at some point to start doing jogless stripes because I learned they exist. I was like, I want to do that because I don't like my stripes to be very visible. I actually don't know how well you can see that here. I mean, I didn't do the best job, as I said, I was learning, but the beginning of round was in the middle of the back here, and I think I did a pretty good job hiding it. Essentially you just pull up a stitch from the last round, or one leg of your stitch from the last round, and you knit it together with your current stitch, and that way it kind of hides the joke a little bit because it shifts the stitch upward. So that's something that is very easy to do. It doesn't take any extra work really, but it makes a big difference in the outcome. And I would also say that for the next trick, which is alternating yarn skeins. That's not something you always have to do. So if you buy yarn for, let's say, a sweater, and you get it from like a popular yarn place where they produce a lot of yarn with machines and everything, then that's not necessary. But if you buy hand-dyed yarns, for example, or if you buy yarn and then you run out and then you buy more, you can sometimes see that they are different dye lots. So even though you buy the same color, they look very slightly different. So basically, if for any reasons you have small variations in the color of your yarn, it is very visible if you use your skeins one after another. So you might be knitting a sleeve and you might be using one ball of yarn from one color and then switch to a different ball of yarn of the same color technically, but it is slightly different. And then you can usually see the line here. And to avoid that, you can just switch between the skeins all the time. Like most people will probably do one round of one skein and then one round of the other skein. And that way you could kind of hide it. It's more like moral. And that way, again, you have a much better outcome with very little effort. And then for the better fit category, the first thing I would recommend doing in some cases is a folded collar. I am not usually the biggest fan of folded collars. I feel like they sometimes look a little bit bulky. Like this is a sweater I have, for example, this is my Maybe Forever sweater where I decided to not fold down the collar. If you don't want to do it, you can usually just knit half the collar and then just not fold it. I knitted all of the collar because I wanted it to fit a little bit higher, but usually like in the pattern this is folded inside and fastened here. So this is more what it would look like. I'm not very good at folding this. Anyway, since this is such a floppy fabric, I didn't want to do the folded collar because I felt like it would just add a lot of bulk over here when the rest of the sweater doesn't really mirror that, you know. So I decided against it here, but there are some cases in which it makes sense and also makes sense to adjust the pattern if it doesn't have that. This sweater, for example, does have it in the pattern, but I also decided to do it even though usually, as I said, it's not my preference because this is a round yoke sweater. And for a round yoke sweater, it doesn't really have any seams. So if you knit raglan sweaters or saddle shoulder sweaters, you will see that they have seams here. And that kind of gives the yoke a little more stability and structure. Whereas for a round yoke sweater that doesn't have any seams, all of the weight of the yoke is hanging on the collar. So I find it more practical and a little more flattering to have a bit of support up here. I have this a bit thicker and more structural, so it can actually support all of the weight of the yoke. Another small tweak you can make to the yoke of your sweater is to knit short rows. Short rows cause the back of your garment to come up a little bit higher than the front, because that is just how humans are shaped. The back of your neck should sit a little bit higher, and that way your sweater will usually be more comfortable to wear, because otherwise it might press on your neck in the front a little bit, which, you know, gets uncomfortable after a while. So especially if you have a sweater that's a little bit tight here, I would always advise to do the short rows. This is a sweater that does have short rows, and you can see that by holding it up on the shoulder seams, and you can see that the back sticks out a little bit higher than the front. And you will also see that when you look at store-bought sweaters, if you hold them up like that, that the back is always higher. This sweater doesn't have any short rows. I think probably because it would have been really complicated to do with a brioche. And you can see that when I hold that one up, that the back and the front are at the same height. For this sweater, it's fine. As I said, it's very floppy, it's not super uncomfortable up here. It's also very oversized, so it kind of adjusts to where it needs to be. But the tighter your sweater is, the more difficult it will be for your yoke to balance the difference between the back and the front. So this would also be a sweater where it would probably be fine to not do the short rows, but if you knit something tighter than this, I think I would just include them in general. And then the last step I want to include here is to knit increases before your sweater hems. It's obviously down to personal preference if you would like to do that or not. I personally have wider hips, but I still want an oversized boxy fit on me. And I feel like for a lot of sweaters that don't include that step, it just doesn't look very flattering on me, because then my hips become the tightest fitting point of the sweater and it just doesn't look oversized anymore. It just looks too large at the top and too small at the bottom. It's just a little awkward, I find. So what I started doing is, for example, if we take this sweater here again, you can see pretty well that this was knitted on a larger needle. I think this was 5mm, and then for the hem I switched to a smaller needle, so ribbing already like cinches in by itself, but you usually would also switch to a smaller needle, making that effect even more pronounced. Like if I hold it like that, I guess you can kind of see that the ribbing is smaller. And for this sweater, that's intended, that's what I wanted, but most of the time I want my sweater to go straight down and not get smaller at the bottom. So what I've started doing is before I start my ribbing, I will knit one increase row. You can do a swatch for your ribbing and just see how much exactly you would need to increase to have the same circumference. That's like an extra step and a little bit more work, but usually the number should be between like 10 and 20%. So you can just use that as like somewhat of an idea of how many increases you should work. And I mean, the ribbing is stretchy, so you will definitely fit into your sweater. The question is just how much space do you still want around your hips. But I just find that one increase row is a very easy fix for a lot of sweaters that I found not very flattering on me. And then I have a few tips on how to fix small mistakes that might happen commonly while you're knitting. And the first one is to put an elastic on the collar. I don't really know how much of a mistake that is, but sometimes they just end up a little bit loose, or this one kind of ended loose on purpose because I didn't fold it down. And something nice that you can do at the end is to just include an elastic into it. You can see it that well, but this black part here is the elastic. I just pulled it through the ribbed part, and that way it's like stretchy, but when I'm wearing it, you know, it stays in place. It doesn't get floppier with time, especially if you're using it a lot or you're washing it. The ribbing sometimes tends to flare out a bit, I guess, or just like lose its structure. So putting an elastic in there is quite nice. This one has a folded down collar, so I didn't really find it necessary. It holds its shape pretty well on its own, but especially for the floppier collars, that's quite nice of a fix. And another thing that I forget way too often, but I've actually done here with my whip that I have laying around next to me, is to leave a longer tail of yarn, there goes my stitch marker, under the arm when you're doing the sleeves. So when you're knitting top down, you will usually put sleeve stitches on hold at some point, or you will like pick up for sleeves later on. And I always find it a bit tricky to get the gap between your sleeve and your body to properly close at the underarm, especially if it's a type of construction where you put stitches on hold and then you pick up stitches from the underarm for the sleeve again. For this one I had to pick up stitches all around the sleeve, so I found that a bit easier, but I still left a very, very long tail down here, because if you end up having any little gaps between here and here on this join, you can later, when you're weaving in the ends, kind of sew them closed. It's a bit janky, but you know, nobody will see, and I've been doing that on almost all of my sweaters. And then the last step I have for this category is to use duplicate stitch to fix the small mistakes in your knitting. Duplicate stitch is usually a color work technique, I guess, where instead of putting the motif into your garment as you're knitting it, you would knit a blank slate first, and then use a tapestry needle and your color to go over the stitches in the shape of the stitch to put the motif on later. And that can be practical if your motif is like smaller but very complicated to put into your knitting at first. But you can also use it just like for a single stitch if you messed up somewhere. For example, if you knit color work like this and you realize there's one stitch that's the wrong color, you can just pick the right color and go over it with a duplicate stitch, and then you should mostly not be able to see that. But I've actually also used it for texture mistakes. So I remember for this Elliot sweater that I made, I had like a purl stitch randomly somewhere in my stockinette fabric on the right side. I think it was in one of the front panels, but I honestly don't remember where. But essentially this is all stockinette here, and I had just had one random purl bump because I wasn't paying attention. So I just went over that with a duplicate stitch as well, and that hides it pretty well too. Obviously, like if you go very, very close, you can sometimes see the other color shine through, or you can see that the fabric is a little bit thicker on that spot because it is 2 layers of yarn on top of each other, but it's a very quick fix for this little spot on your knitting that you know you'll always see and always be annoyed by other way. And then I have some tips for usability, I guess. The first one is just about making sure that you're using up all of your yarn that you intend to use up for a project, especially for small accessories like these ones, for example, that you have 2 of. I find it very practical to weigh my yarn and divide it before. I mean, you can also just use the length, but that's going to be a lot of work. So what I like to do, I like to just roll about half on one skein and then leave one half on the other, and then I weigh both of them to make sure I have the same amount on both skeins, and then you can use up one exactly and know that you have enough for the other. So you don't have any weird little leftovers that you have to decide what to do with or get rid of, because it's just, you know, a bit of an awkward amount in the end. And then my second tip is to steam block things instead of wet blocking things. It doesn't really work for all types of fabrics. Like for most, I think wet blocking looks a little bit nicer. Like something like that I would probably be wet blocking, especially when fabrics are a little bit more delicate and you feel like you might ruin them, or you need something blocked very fast because you made a gift net, for example, and you need to get it done very quickly. You can just use your iron on, I guess, a lower setting and put something in between, like a wet cloth, like a wet dish towel works very well for me. And then you can just iron over it. And for this, that's what I did, for example, because I hate washing this yarn. This is drops air, and it gets even floppier when it's wet, and it scares me because it's also alpaca and it's, I don't know, I'm just scared to felt it. So I just steam blocked this. I just ironed over it with a wet cloth in between, and then you can still see the texture like come to life a little bit. All of these knit columns bloom up, and that worked out pretty well for this. So that's definitely a nice little thing you can do to avoid ruining something by blocking it. And then the last thing I have, and something I need to start doing more again, because I'm always too lazy and I don't like that, is to put little tags in your sweater. So when you buy a store-bought sweater, obviously, most of the time you will have a tag in the back. And I never noticed how much I rely on that for telling me where the back is until I started knitting. Because even if you knit short rows where you can technically see which is the back when you hold it up, I still have to like turn it around 7 times and look for it all the time. And for this sweater, for example, I just used a little piece of old t-shirt that I sewed in the back. It's not very pretty. I think you can definitely find nicer versions of that than this one, but I just find it so practical to grab this and immediately see where the back is. So that's something I should also do with all of my newer sweaters, because I've kind of given up on that project, but little reminder for myself, I guess. So that was all of the tips that I could come up with for now. If you have any similar little hacks, you can share them in the comments. I would love to hear about them, and we can all help each other be a little bit better at knitting. And I will get back to my wonderful little project here. I'm so excited about this. I've been knitting on this obsessively ever since I started, which is what I say every time. I always am obsessed with a new project. And then my excitement fades as I go on until I start a new one, but I think that's a very common problem. Anyways, right now I'm still having a lot of fun with this, so I'll get back to that, and I will tell you more about this one next week in my new podcast episode, so I hope I'll see you there.